These are the reflections for the second Sunday of Advent, Year C. The first reading comes from the Book of Baruch. Now, Baruch was the secretary of the prophet Jeremiah, but we're not sure that that secretary actually wrote the Book of Baruch. It might have been written in his name. One of the reasons we doubt it is that we only have the text in Greek, so it's one of what's called the deuterocanonical books. They're the books in the Old Testament that are accepted by Catholics, but are not accepted by the Jewish people or by Protestants. This passage follows a long lamentation, bemoaning the fact that Israel, Judah had been punished, carried off into exile. But typical of many prophetic books, this one speaks about a restoration, that God would bring the people of Israel back, that Jerusalem would be destroyed, that even if the people of Israel had been accompanied into exile by their enemies, they would be accompanied out of exile by God himself. And they would be able to sit under the shade of trees, no longer subject to the glare of an unforgiving sun, but rather God would give them sustenance. God would give them relief from their many sufferings. And it's important to remember that this reading is a preparation for the birth of Jesus, that we're getting ready for it, but we're not quite there yet. That we're just talking about the beginnings of the preparation, something we'll see in the gospel. The second reading is from the letter to the Philippians. Now, Paul very much liked this community. They were doing very, very well. So much so that when Paul went as a missionary to Thessalonica, the Philippians sent little envelopes filled with money to help pay his needs. The Philippians were faithful. They shared the sufferings that Paul shared, being imprisoned, and yet they continued to give a good example of what it meant to be a Christian. And so Paul tells them, just as you've been doing all along, continue to do it, but more and more. That's something that we heard in the second reading on the first Sunday of Advent, something that continues, that this is a time of conversion. Advent is an opportunity to present to Jesus a gift of our hearts that have been purified. It's a time to prepare a place for Jesus to be laid to rest, no longer a crib in a cave, but now our hearts. And the gospel is from Luke 3, 1-6. This is typical of Luke. He begins this passage by mentioning that this is the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar. Pontius Pilate was governor of Judea, Herod tetrarch of Galilee. Luke tends to be a name dropper. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Number one, Luke is writing for a Gentile Christian audience and trying to draw Gentiles to the faith. In order to do that, he has to show that Christians are good citizens. So that message is found over and over again in the Gospel of Luke and again in Acts of the Apostles. Christians should not be persecuted because they're really faithful Roman citizens. But the other element of this is to tie the story into history. This is not one of those pagan myths that people would tell about the gods on Olympus. This is something that happened only a few years ago, and there are still witnesses who can give witness to what happened. Luke wants to make sure that these people realize this is true history. And what is this story about? The beginning of the mission of John the Baptist. We hear that John was called in the wilderness. Now, the wilderness is another way of saying the desert. Some scholars believe that the place in the desert where John was actually Qumran. We know that there was a community of celibate Jewish monks at Qumran who prepared for the end of the world, who practiced ablutions, washings every day, similar to the baptism that John used in his ministry. And many of the words that John preached are very similar to the Essene message. The Essenes being that community in Qumran. Qumran being at the edge of the Dead Sea. By the way, you probably heard of the Qumran scrolls. They're a series of many scrolls that this community prepared that were hidden in caves when the community was destroyed. And they're very important for scholarship in our days. Well, what is John's role? It's foretold in the message of Isaiah. A voice is heard in the wilderness. It prepares the ways of the Lord. John the Baptist is not the Messiah. He's not the center of attention. His role is to point to Jesus. Remember, he already started doing that when Mary visited Elizabeth and John leapt for joy in Elizabeth's womb. Now, this is the fulfillment of his mission, to go out and proclaim the kingdom of God, that it's dawning in their very midst. And may God bless us.